Hi, everyone. My name is Chris Paris, and my presentation is an epistemology of faith, belief, trust, virtue. We'll be talking about various potential definitions for faith in creating our epistemology of faith. Let's dive in and look at our objectives. First of all, we want to attempt to define faith. That's a big task, but it's essential for an epistemology of faith. We're going to end up focusing on faith as epistemic trust. We're going to also contrast demonstration and revelation, ultimately concluding that revelation is greater than demonstration. Since we're talking about epistemology, we'll see if faith qualifies as knowledge, and we'll also explore faith/trust in approaching the world. Now, before I ever begin thinking about a topic or a specific word, I like to see the popular definition. So I looked at thesaurus.com and made this concept map of faith with some of the synonyms, which are belief, assent, conviction, hope, loyalty, confidence, acceptance, and truth. Assent is going to be one of the big ones we'll discuss today. Then, further out on the next tier, we see certainty, credulity, sureness, fidelity, certitude as our synonyms. We can also look at the antonyms of faith. This shows the wide range of definitions of faith. The strongest are disbelief, disloyalty, and of course, we have lying and treachery, all things that would not be trust. But if we look back here, I was very surprised not to see trust specifically mentioned as a definition here, even though it would appear very much like a synonym, and trust would be the antithesis of many of these words as well. My interest in the project in defining faith comes from my research in the Hebrew scriptures in looking at the word amen, which means firm trust. A visual element of faith or firm trust in the Hebrew scriptures are pillars of support that are sure, lasting, confirmed, or established. There's also like a nail being fixed in a firm place. We might even think of a tent peg. But one of the most fascinating ones that connects to an epistemology of faith is nourishing, as in guardianship. In Numbers 11:12, we see Moses described as a nursing father, like a nurse who carries or nourishes an infant. And we will see that aspect of faith in virtue leading believers to a revelation of God. There are also etymology from Latin and Greek. Fides is polysemic and can mean faith, trust, or reliability. And then pistis is also polysemic, but the core sense is a state of being rationally led by what another says. And then there's the standard biblical definition of faith from Hebrews 11:1. Now, faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. And we turn to St. Thomas for a little bit of commentary on that. He writes that in us, the first beginnings of things to be hoped for is brought about by the assent of faith, because we hope to be made happy through seeing the unveiled truth to which our faith cleaves. If faith is also the evidence of things not seen, it is because it is grounded in the conviction that the truths expressed by the propositions of faith, while indeed unseen, are nevertheless worthy of assent. And that is going to be a very much a pillar of what we're talking about. Propositions, though unseen, are worthy of assent. What is faith? We're going to argue that faith is a form of knowledge and that faith is trust. We have faith as trust in a speaker, specifically the speaker being divine. When we think about faith, it is a kind of epistemic trust expressed deeply with the religious object, according to McCraw. And a typical motivation for faith, according to Seibert, is that the speaker is truthful. And we'll also be looking at faith as virtue to lead us to that revelation, to the ultimate end of knowing God. Faith is not groundless belief. It is also not presumption. There is the example offered of a jury. Presumption is not the same as belief or assent. In a jury, they are required to presume, but not to believe that the defendant is innocent. And such a presumption aims not at the epistemic goal of producing the most accurate belief, but at the practical goal of causing the least harm to others. So that idea of presuming the good is a moral, not an epistemic role. And so I think that takes us in some interesting ways that faith is not a presumption, and faith is also different from opinion in science. And we'll get a chance to talk about that more fully when we contrast demonstration and revelation. So, in thinking about the etymological basis of faith, what faith is not, I worked on defining faith, and here's what I came up with through looking at all the scholars that I focus on in this presentation. Through being drawn or inclined by hope and love, we develop faith as an epistemic trust that is just assent to the unseen, determined by the will and reason, through a graced intellect that illumines the mind through the light of truth to accept propositions as genuine revelations from God, preparing the believer for the full knowledge of God. And we add to this to form us as a person and lead us to the ultimate end. Faith is a good cognitive disposition or habit, a virtue. This intellectual virtue generates the virtue of wisdom. So that's a lot. So let's focus more on it by mapping it out with our definition of faith. So, first of all, we have faith is inclined by love and hope, like faith, hope, and charity, the three working together. And our central idea is that faith is epistemic trust. McCraw argues that religious faith in is a species of epistemic trust, and he shows how trust works as the genus of faith. And it is determined by the will and reason. And Seibert adds that, following Augustine, Aquinas says that faith in the broadest sense is just assent to the unseen by contrast with assent to what one sees to be true. And then I also added that faith works through a graced intellect that illumines the mind about the revelation of God. And then running parallel to that, faith is an intellectual virtue, generating the virtue of wisdom, leading to the ultimate end, and both leading to God. And those kind of run parallel, but I wanted to get not only the illuminating power of revelation, but also the work of virtue in the life of a believer. Some might say, though, when we talk about faith, that it's just blind faith, that if it's in the unseen, that's what it's got to be. But even in Aquinas' view, if the intellect assents to truths that remain unseen, it is not assent blindly, given that it is illumined by the supernaturally infused light of faith, itself a distinct mode of intellective vision that enables the intellect to see what propositions of faith proposed by for belief have been revealed by God and consequently express the truth about God. So Aquinas is going to argue that the light of faith is more capable of causing assent than any demonstration, given that it, unlike the light of reason, cannot fail because God cannot be deceived or lie. So it is not a blind faith, but it is trusting in the ultimate testimony, in which is the revelation of God. When we think about faith, will, and reason, these might seem to be antithetical to each other or competing with each other. And I kind of liked this picture here because we can see where that they can coalesce and work together. And Seibert says it is essential to faith that one's assent is determined partly by the will. However, this condition does not make Aquinas a crude doxastic voluntarist, since assent is not commanded by the will alone. He's not arguing that they just have control over their beliefs and choose what do they believe at will. But the will, under the direction of one's reason, is what determines it. Faith, therefore, is not just a belief on a whim. It is a matter of managing one's assent for the best of the human as a whole. And I think that's essential, that we define faith not as something that is blind or something that is on a whim, but there's will and reason, and it all works together. When we're looking at faith as knowledge, we can see faith as cognito. It is not intellectus. It is not scientia, where the intellect fails to see there is divine authority. And then scientific knowledge also gets us into the area of demonstration versus revelation. That science is focusing on the demonstration, but not the revelatory aspect, which is what we are looking at. We look at science and opinion then. Demonstration forces assent, while opinion, Seibert suggests, gives assent no more than is required by the evidence. Even strong opinion, it seems, is stronger only in response to one's evidence. So neither science nor opinion has the special merit of faith. So there's something special about faith that goes beyond just demonstration, but sees the power of revelation. And when we contrast demonstration versus revelation, we see that demonstration is not the best. Revelation is greater than demonstration. And we have the example of the demons who assent on the basis of the same evidences available to the faithful, but they're moved solely by the rational weight of those evidences. Rather than any affection or inclination in the will, they do so without merit. So the believer has the revelation and the will moves, but the demons are just forced to move by demonstration. And I thought about the end of the Gospel of Mark, where it talks about the signs following the believers. We have an example of the demonstration follows those who have the revelation. And then we can think about faith and miracles. Boethius says, for the view of philosophers rests on demonstration and on other possible arguments in those matters whereof they speak. But in many instances, faith rests on miracles and not rational arguments. But here's the key: that which is held because it follows from rational arguments is not faith, but knowledge, which is scientia. So we're talking about a very specific knowledge here, the cognito knowledge of faith. So science oftentimes is always wanting that demonstration, but faith has the revelation. Aquinas says unbelievers are in ignorance of things that are of faith, for neither do they see or know them in themselves, nor do they know them to be credible. The faithful, on the other hand, know them, once again, not as by demonstration, but by the light of faith, which makes them see that they ought to believe them. And we can see when we think about miracles that that could be problematic because even in the days of Christ, there were other people claiming to perform miracles. There were magic, there were tricksters. And so we come to trust as fides. Recovering the historical aspect of fides as trust grants access to an often overlooked epistemological approach to knowledge based on trusting virtuous speakers, which offers an alternative and more hopeful perspective. We can trust the prophets, the history of the Israelites, the Bible, the creeds, the testimony of religious leaders and believers. And so testimony becomes powerful. But after looking at all the aspects of faith and thinking about faith versus science, is faith knowledge? McDonald says that Thomistic faith qualifies at least potentially as knowledge from even a contemporary epistemological standpoint, insofar it consists of true belief that is appropriately justified and warranted by virtue of being supernaturally informed and generated. He goes on to ask, does faith qualify as knowledge when we consider some mainline standards of contemporary epistemology? So this is not just about theology, but about contemporary epistemology. And he says yes. It consists of justified and warranted true belief, deeply rooted in theological virtue. He says the assent of faith is justified or internally rational, but it's not just the internal, it's the external. The assent of faith is justified as externally rational in an appropriate epistemic environment according to an acquired design plan successfully aimed at truth, or alternatively born out of reliable, truth conducive belief forming processes or practices epistemically linked with the believer's desire to see God and hence the proper functioning of the believer's will. This desire to see God is limited, however, to this life, because the full knowledge of God, the beatific vision, is properly reserved for the blessed in heaven. But faith in God is properly attributable to persons in this life who believe in God, and more specifically, the revealed truth about God, but who simply lack the requisite cognitive ability to see God. How do we get there in this life and move forward? We must have faith as a habit or a virtue, which Aquinas talks about. That faith is also fundamentally a good cognitive disposition or habit. It's a virtue that enables its possessors to form true beliefs about God, that is, beliefs with propositional contents to express something about the nature of who God is. And this faith must be perfected by love. Now, it is evident from what has been said that the act of faith is directed to the object of the will, i.e., the good as it ends, Aquinas says, and this good, which is the end of faith, viz., the divine good, is the proper object of charity. Therefore, charity or love is called the form of faith insofar as the act of faith is perfected by charity. And it is essential that it be protected by charity because of trust. In what or whom one places one's faith seems to mean a lot for one's cognitive or epistemic approach to the world. And I really wanted to focus on this, not just a matter of faith, but to ask, what do people in the secular world focus on? Oftentimes the answer will be science, but we've dealt quite a bit with that in demonstration being lesser than revelation. And when I thought about what do people in the world trust, I considered the consumer confidence index. Will people buy things based on their trust in the government, in corporations, that they will keep their job? That is very much something we could talk about, perhaps an epistemology of faith in a sort of secular sense, I think would be worthwhile. I also got this chart from the Pew Research Center, Reasons None Say They Don't Identify with a Religion. A lot of it was based on trust, that they didn't trust religious leaders and that they questioned a lot of religious teachings. But I also wanted to focus from an epistemological perspective from faith. They say, I believe it can be moral without religion. An epistemology of faith would say, no, that is absolutely not possible. You don't have the divine revelation, so you can't do that. You don't have the virtue leading you through grace and love to God. So there is great power in faith. God works in the mind of the believer by way of persuasion rather than coercion, directing it to assent to propositions otherwise, under strictly natural epistemic conditions, considered to be unworthy of assent. McDonald's given us a lot of good information, and he says that Aquinas offers a rich realist epistemology of faith and thus a viable model of the knowledge of God that deserves to be further developed and explored. We've tried to do a little bit of it here. I recommend reading his work and the works of these other individuals. Hopefully, we have got everyone thinking about an epistemology of faith, how to define it, what it might mean, the various aspects of it. Hope you've enjoyed this presentation. I look forward to hearing your questions and comments.